Wendy Bellion is coming up next. She is a professor of art history and the Sewell Biggs Chair of American Art at the University of Delaware. Professor Bellion holds a PhD and MA from Northwestern University and a bachelor's degree from Wesleyan University. She's taught at Rutgers and the College of William and Mary. And she has served as a Terra Visiting Professor at the University of Paris. She has held research fellowships with the Library Company of Philadelphia, the American Antiquarian Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and Winterthur Museum, among other places. Her scholarship is interdisciplinary in approach, focusing on the early United States and exploring the cultural geographies of the British Atlantic world and early modern Americas. Her book, Citizen Spectator, Art, Illusion, and Visual Perception in Early National America, which was awarded the 2014 Charles C. Eldredge Prize for Outstanding Scholarship by the Smithsonian American Art Museum, examines the post-revolutionary exhibition of trompe-l'oeil paintings and optical illusions in Philadelphia. In addition to several articles on Charles Willson Peale and other early American artists, she is co-editor with Mónica Domínguez Torres of Objects in Motion, Art and Material Culture Across Colonial North America, a special issue of the Winterthur Portfolio. Her latest book project, due out from Penn State University Press in 2019, is entitled The Great Fall, Iconoclasm in New York City Since the American Revolution. With that, I want to welcome Professor Bellion.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It is truly an honor to be here this morning to help get the symposium underway. And I'm looking forward to all the papers and conversations to come throughout the day. I want to begin by offering my thanks to Erica for her invitation to speak at the conference. And my congratulations to the Visual Culture Program on its 10th anniversary. I feel like we should be singing happy birthday to the library company, don't you? One of my very first fellowships was here some 20 years ago as a graduate student. And I can truly say that basically all of my subsequent work has built upon that experience here in so many ways, and is largely thanks to the knowledge and the intellectual generosity of the library company's staff. I'm sure that many of you have had the experience of working upstairs in the collections and talking to Erica and Sarah about what you're working on, and suddenly 10 minutes later they'll walk over and say, "Did you know we had this?" And you will say, "Why, no, I didn't know you had that." And it kind of changes everything. So thank you so much. I also want to offer a very overdue thanks to Jim Green, who, when I was here as a research fellow 20 years ago, and he was asking me about my work I was doing. At that time, I was thinking about what the second floor of the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall, looked like. And he said, "Have you ever been inside there?" It was closed at that point. And I said, "No." And he picked up the phone and he called Carrie Dethorne, and the next day I was touring the space. So, so thank you, Jim. One more person I want to mention here, and that's Lily Milroy, who's sitting right back here. Lily has been a dear friend and mentor for about 30 years since we were at Wesleyan together. It's only 5 years ago. So I'm especially delighted to have the opportunity to bookend this symposium together with Lily. All right, I think that this has finished loading, so let's go ahead and get going. This is always the point where I say I'm a Mac user and I have to remind myself. All right, there we are. Okay, As I began to think about my talk for today, it seemed to me that a keynote should try to do several things. First, to offer a sense of breadth regarding Birch and American visual culture, thereby laying some of the groundwork for the talks that will follow throughout the morning and afternoon. Second, to suggest Birch's ongoing significance for scholars of American art and history. And third, to expand upon the very premise of this symposium. That is, that we can discern the complexities of American visual culture both in and through the example of William Birch, hence my title, How William Birch Matters in 2018. Now, as many of you will already know, there's been an impressive growth of new scholarship on Birch over the past decade or so. This symposium and the library's wonderful exhibition offers a very strong index of the robust ideas and research that Birch's work continues to inspire. Looking back across recent years, I also think of the 2010 Symposium on Birch, held at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, and the important 2011 book, William Birch, Picturing the American Scene, co-authored by Emily Cooperman and Lee Carson Shirk. It's worth underscoring that scholars in diverse fields of early American studies, including Lily Milroy, Gigi Barnhill, who's also here today, Gary Nash and Ryan Smith, have continued to turn to Birch to explicate histories of landscape, printing, the city, and architecture, each of them building in different ways upon the formative scholarship of Martin Snyder in the mid-20th century. This keynote even sent me back to research on Birch that I did for my 2011 book and a subsequent article, and I'll touch upon some of that material today. If this symposium occasions a retrospective look at the Birch scholarship, though, it simultaneously invites us to look forward. Where does new research on Birch go from here? Is his work still meaningful for the kinds of questions that we're asking now in visual studies, in the humanities, in public life? How is an 18th century artist still relevant in 2018? Now let me be clear that I pose that question from a position of empathy. Those of us who study and teach the art of the long 18th century are very familiar with the challenges of getting students and exhibition goers interested in a world that can seem so far removed from our own. But I think that claims about the cultural distance of the 18th century tend to be a bit exaggerated. Just think of the many public dialogues today that have roots in 18th century phenomena or debates, nationalism or decolonization, to name just two. If we think of the ongoing claims about women's place in the public sphere that Judith Sargent Murray began to articulate in the 1770s, or the Black lives that Phyllis Wheatley made visible in her poetry of the same decade, then the 18th century begins to feel quite close to 2018. So how then does William Birch matter now? There's many ways of answering that question, and I've mulled over several of them in terms of exploring that question for this talk. For example, I've just finished up a book about iconoclasm in early New York, and with images of ruination fresh in my head, I couldn't help but think back to this plate from the first edition of Birch's Views, which pictures the unfinished house of Robert Morris, the man who famously financed the American Revolution and just as famously ended up broke thanks to over-speculation in the 1790s. And you can see both this plate and a preparatory sketch in one of the cases in the exhibition. Birch registers Morris's implosion through the spectacle of his hapless dance. And in so doing, he manifests a period association between human bodies and human dwellings. One that we might relate, for instance, to the house of the colonial Massachusetts governor Thomas Hutchinson, which was sacked and destroyed in the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. At the same time, though, Birch also invites us to see how these forms remain yoked today in a visual imaginary of disaster. I wrote about Birch's depiction of Morris's folly as the house became known for my 2011 book, arguing that Birch represented the building as a failure of Morris's vision. I drafted that argument about 2008. And in retrospect, I can now discern a rather obvious resonance that somehow I didn't quite see before. Namely, a tendency in the visual culture of circa 2008 to represent unfinished houses as signs of the Great Recession. This example from the New York Times says it all: sold unfinished, vision required. The image gives us a dream gone awry, the detritus in the foreground, emblematic of both excess and loss. And in so doing, it develops an analogy between ruined houses, lives, and finances that takes us back to Birch's era. Flash forward 10 years later, and the crisis is different. Quite literally, the flash flooding in the Carolinas caused by Hurricane Florence. But once again, the visual trope is similar. A house works to signify human distress. Birch was certainly not the first to invent a metaphorics of houses as humans, but he was among the first in the United States to visualize it. And these quick examples suggest the staying power of this pictorial convention. Other ways of examining how Birch matters now might revisit the relative invisibility and marginalization of African American figures in the Philadelphia views. And this plate of Arch Street is one of the very few that pictures a black laborer. We know that Birch disproportionately underrepresented the black population of Philadelphia in 1800. And in light of current directions in critical race studies, we might ask whether Birch was constructing the city as a series of white spaces, to cite the urban ethnographer Elijah Anderson. That is, public spaces that are visually and socially distinguished by, quote, the overwhelming presence of white people and the absence of black people. On a similar note, consider how Birch pictured Native Americans when they visited Philadelphia to contest government claims on their land, as in this plate of 4th Street, where a group of indigenous men figure as tourists and sightseers. If there were ever an argument to decolonize Birch's views, this one might be a good place to start. Now, while any of these angles might be fruitful to explore, I actually want to introduce and focus on two other points today, two ways of suggesting the continuing importance of Birch and his work. First, immigration. As a British immigrant who materially enriched the life of the arts in the early national period, Birch has much to teach us about the nature of what we call American art. For the politics of inclusivity and exclusivity around immigration bear upon the histories of art and visual culture that we write. Second, intermediality. As the library's exhibition demonstrates, Birch worked across various artistic media and genres. Less familiar is the way that his work intersected with the Philadelphia theater as a space of artistic innovation and display. Understanding this fluidity as an instance of intermediality allows us to revisit Birch and his period through newer methodologies. So immigration and intermediality, these are each very large topics, and I'm only going to sketch them in pretty broad strokes. Nevertheless, I hope that they will suggest how Birch crystallizes visual complexities both then and now. So I realize this is an audience that will already be familiar with the history of Birch's immigration and his self-made career in the early US, but just to review a few quick facts. In 1794, Birch left a modestly successful practice as an engraver and enamelist in London to emigrate to Philadelphia with his family. It was an advantageous time in the city's cultural development, and Birch joined an international community of artists and patrons from countries including Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, or Haiti. Here's Birch in a miniature from the early 19th century. Birch quickly developed a patronage among the city's wealthy merchants and statesmen, and within just 4 years he was at work, together with his son Thomas and the engraver Samuel Seymour, on the creation of drawings and hand-colored engravings for the city of Philadelphia, better known as the Philadelphia Views. As many scholars have noted, this folio of 28 prints marked a first for American art and visual culture. It was an achievement in the technology of printing, for example, and a visual document, albeit a highly selective one, of the city at a turning point in its history. While there were precedents for such undertakings in pictorial volumes of London, nothing like this had quite been attempted yet for any American city. I still find it striking that Birch initiated the creation of the Views in 1798, just 4 years after his arrival, and brought it to completion so quickly in 1800, just 2 years later. I previously suggested how a close interrogation of the composition of the views betrays evidence of Birch and his son Thomas obtaining their bearings within the city, positioning themselves on street corners or behind bollards, or in this case, shimmying onto the shelves in the high street market in order to grasp the new material world that they were seeing. Today, thinking about what it meant for new arrivals to undertake this project, I might posit a bolder reading, that the Birches mediated their very experience of immigration, their encounters with and immersion within a new place, through these practices of depiction. In this regard, the views offer not an empirical record of the city as it looked, but rather a subjective representation of how it was looked at, and looked at specifically through the eyes of British immigrants. That Birch saw his art as an entree into American life is further suggested by his active contribution to the Columbianum Academy and its one and only exhibition in the spring of 1795. Just months after his arrival, Birch joined Charles Willson Peale, William Rush, and other local artists in the hopeful formation of an art academy loosely modeled on the example of London's Royal Academy. Their ambitions were soon waylaid by political divisions, but not before the artists managed to realize what we would today call a group exhibition, the first of its kind in either colonial or early national history. It brought together the work of roughly 40 contemporary artists. This was contemporary for 1795. And as such, it was a very impressive achievement. No comparable exhibition would be attempted until the annual exhibitions of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1811. William Birch was quite literally the first in show. Not only did the catalog begin with his name and address printed large enough for any potential patrons to find him, he was also represented by more works of art than anyone else. Although we see 18 entries here, including one crossed out, the actual line items add up to almost 30 distinct works of art in enamel, pencil, and print. This is an artist announcing his virtuosity. And although he didn't advertise his status as a newcomer, he wasn't alone at the Columbianum in being an immigrant or a foreigner to the United States. On the second page of the catalog, we find work by two of his children, then a Mr. Big, identified as a member of Britain's Royal Academy. Further down, we encounter John and Frederick Eckstein, a father-son team of carvers from Germany, and then 6 works by a Mr. Duché, probably Thomas Spence Duché, an Englishman whose ancestors included Huguenots who fled France for North America. All of which leads to a very basic observation. The first so-called American art exhibition was in large part an exhibition of immigrants. It's a simple point, but one with contemporary resonance. Let me explain. In early 2017, as the federal government began to announce a travel ban on immigrants from selected countries, the Davis Museum at Wellesley College devised an ingenious way to call attention to the quantity and visibility of art by immigrants in its collection. The text explains that about 20% of the art in the museum was either made or donated by immigrants. And I quote, "For the days leading up to and including the President's Day holiday weekend," it states, "we have removed or cloaked these works to demonstrate symbolically what the Davis Museum would look like without their contributions to our collections and to Wellesley College, and to thereby honor their many invaluable gifts." Here's how these plans looked in action. Works of art by immigrants were removed, and labels added that called out their absence. The nails and hooks remained on the wall, marking the places where art had been. While some labels noted the immigrant status of the makers, moreover, others identified the immigrant donors who had helped to build the collection. Through this signage, here's an example, and these displacements, the museum made evident something that had always been there, but perhaps had been taken for granted, that its collection would not be what it is today without the vision and generosity of immigrants to the U.S. Now, it might seem like we're a long way from the early national period, and if that's the case, let me note that one of the paintings removed from the walls of the Davis Museum was this well-known portrait of George Washington by the German immigrant Adolf Ulrich Wertmüller. who was active for many years here in Philadelphia alongside William Birch. The museum thereby demonstrated that immigration is not just of significance for contemporary art and artists. It also points back to the art history of the founding generation. Indeed, the Davis installation, or more accurately its de-installation, invites us to imagine what the Columbiana might have looked like without art by immigrants. Any work by Birch and his children would have to go. So would that of Mr. Big, the Royal Academician. We'd say goodbye to the Ecksteins from Germany and to the many pictures of Duché. We're left with just two artists, John Singleton Copley and Joseph Wright, but they're no less complicated with regards to some idea of Americanness, because both of them spent much of their working lives abroad in London. In fact, Copley's place of birth is still undetermined. He was born to Irish emigres, but precisely where is a little unknown. And this attribution of work to him has also raised doubts. So we're not left with very much, are we? And this exhibition catalog went on for another 4 pages. You can see them in the exhibition. And those pages are likewise populated with the names of recent immigrants. We could subject Birch's views to a similar experiment, asking how many of his subscribers were recent immigrants. 4 names jump out immediately at me. Maybe you can spot others. They include the printer Matthew Carey from Ireland, the English architect Benjamin Latrobe, and 2 immigrants from Britain who made the Chestnut Street Theater into a cultural jewel of the city, the actress Amy Mary and the director Thomas Wignall. Try to imagine the literary, architectural, or theatrical heritage of Philadelphia without just these 4 individuals. I can't do it. Birch probably couldn't either. Their inclusion on his subscription page suggests that his business network, his system of patronage, was dependent on a community of fellow emigres and patrons from various countries. And I would also note that the Spanish minister to the US appears at the very last name on the list. To put it differently, and in the terms suggested by the Davis Museum labels, the cultural gift of the Philadelphia Views, a volume that we tend to regard as a founding visual document of America, was made possible in large part by immigrants. So my point here is clear, I hope, that some of our primary origin stories for histories of American art and visual culture, namely the Columbianum exhibition and Birch's views, turned upon the contributions of immigrant artists and cultural benefactors. We would simply not have an American art to speak of without the formative contributions of people from around the world. Again, it's a simple observation. But maybe it's one that invites interrogation of that very practice that we call American art history. For many generations, scholars of American art and visual culture sought to identify what was uniquely American in the art of the United States. As a historiographical project, such research often located the origins of American style and iconography in the late colonial or post-revolutionary decades, finding proof of something American in the work of native-born artists and the political symbolism of the federal era. It's been argued that this was an exceptionalist project connected to Cold War politics, and that may be true, but it was also something of a Hegelian project, rooted in 19th century efforts to explain relations between art and culture and to account for artistic change over time. It may be time for a different approach, one that takes a cue from the Davis Museum and tries to wrestle with the multinational presence of artists in the early US. Much recent scholarship has productively excavated the transatlanticism of the late 18th century. But can we go further? Can we imagine an art history or visual history of the early United States that resists the generalizing effects of the term American art? One that decouples the realities of cultural production from the mythologies of national political origins. I think it's that coupling of art and national political origins that allows us to speak somewhat problematically and somewhat teleologically of an early American art, something that always presumes there's a middle and an end. Denaturalizing these familiar categories might be a tall order, but in this, I think that William Birch points the way. intermediality. Birch also invites us to see the complexity of visual media in the early United States in ways that have yet to be fully understood. In short, he opens up a door to exploring the notion of intermediality. Now, many of you will already be familiar with this concept, for it has helped to drive a lot of exciting scholarship in art history, film, performance studies, and other fields that examine the nature and functions of various representational media. Critical histories of intermedia often date the modern introduction of the term to a 1965 essay by Dick Higgins, one of the key figures in the post-war art events known as happenings. Eager to explain the appearance of new performative phenomena that defied familiar categories, indeed operated between them, Higgins suggested the term intermedium for what he called, quote, the uncharted land that lies between collage, music, and theater. In a later reprint of that seminal essay, Higgins would emphasize that intermediality was not historically specific to the postmodern era. Rather, he argued, it has been a possibility since antiquity. In fact, Higgins pointed to a passage from Samuel Coleridge in 1812 that deployed the word intermedia to describe, and I quote, works which fall conceptually between media that are already known. To the best of my knowledge, Birch himself never invoked the term intermedia in his writings. But Coleridge's contemporary understanding of this concept, that is, works which fall conceptually between media that are already known, beautifully describes a production at the Chestnut Street Theater that I believe drew upon Birch's views to realize a rather unprecedented visual display in the city. In other words, the notion of intermediality allows us to unpack the fluidity between media in an unusual spectacle born of that exchange that was operative in Philadelphia about 1800. We've already seen that Birch himself was working within and between different artistic media and genres. At the Columbianum, he put this facility on display, offering miniatures as well as landscape, pictures of a saint and the seasons, even a dolphin. Few other artists in Philadelphia could boast of such range in 1795. Nor did any others cultivate the kind of relationship with the theater that Birch realized in the following decade. We don't know whether Birch attended productions at the Chestnut Street, which was located kitty corner to the State House at Chestnut and Fifth, but we do know that he was keenly attentive to its prominence in the city, and that the theater, in turn, took note of Birch's work. So here I'm going to draw upon an article that I published in 2012 and several related talks. Birch's arrival in 1794 coincided with the opening of the Chestnut Street Theater, also called the New Theater, to distinguish it from an existing playhouse on South Street. It soon became Philadelphia's and one of the country's leading theaters. The directors, Thomas Wignall and Alexander Reinagle, built a sizable company of mostly English actors. They lured talented scene painters from abroad, they imported sets from London theaters, and they developed a repertory of British staples, including comedies like The School for Scandal and tragedies such as Macbeth, and to a lesser extent, they supported newly authored American plays. When the theater began to face competition from other forms of entertainment, such as circuses, one right across the street, the managers introduced lighter fare, such as afterpieces, designed to balance serious dramas, and to maintain the interest of the many social classes who composed their audience. As many as 2,000 people could attend one performance at the Chestnut Street each night. Within a decade, the company was holding regular seasons in Philadelphia, from winter to spring, and then moving to Baltimore and other southern cities for summer residencies. Some of the earliest praise for the Chestnut Street was directed at the appearance of the building itself. And on this note, it's significant that both the first and second editions of Birch's views included these engravings. The earlier view for the 1800 edition, apparently I've got the exhibition now fully on my brain. You can see this in the exhibition. Anyway, the earlier view is the one on the left. Looks west along Chestnut Street from the sidewalk adjoining the State House. The view on the right, for the second edition of 1804, gave even greater visibility to the theater's facade, which had received a neoclassical makeover under the direction of Latrobe. Birch not only offers a closer vantage to the building in the second edition view, by this time he himself was literally around the corner. He had opened a drawing school a block away on 6th Street, taking care to explicitly advertise his location, quote, near the theater. The Chestnut Street community, for its part, was happy to return the favor of Birch's attention. The second edition view was engraved by Gilbert Fox, an artist and actor who rose to prominence in the 1790s. He was famous partly due to his performance of the Federalist song Hail Columbia in 1798, a performance that roused the audience into a partisan frenzy of collective singing. As I've mentioned, Birch also counted the Chestnut Street's director, one of its actresses, and its architect among his subscribers to the views, namely Wignall, Mary, and Latrobe. In fact, a quick study of his subscribers and the theater's shareholders reveals at least 3 more people in common: the merchants John Ashley and Peter Blight, and the lawyer John Beale Wardley and his wife. In numerous ways, then, Birch's life and his art intersected with that of the Chestnut Street. Where this gets really interesting, though, and where we might be able to start speaking of intermediality operative in this world, is in a production mounted by the theater in 1805. A production that appears to have appropriated 2 of Birch's views and scaled them up to huge proportions as part of a novel program of visual entertainments. On March 27, 1805, the Chestnut Street held this unprecedented benefit for its principal scene painter, a man named John Joseph Holland. The theater often organized benefits for its leading actors, but it was rare to honor a scene painter in this way. In addition to a comedy called Wives as They Were, the evening featured a lengthy and spectacular display of scenery designed by Holland and his assistants. This, too, was highly unusual, for it seemed to up the ante of pantomimes and transparencies to illusionistic media that the theater had long relied on to entertain its audiences. Pantomimes featured set designs with changeable effects, so that one object seemed to illusionistically morph into another, like a statue coming to life, or a palace forming into a garden. Pantomimes could deploy transparencies to achieve these illusions. As defined by Ruth Mackenzie, a historian of the Chestnut Street, transparencies were often large drops or drop cloths. Often they would scroll down from above the theater so that they were almost resting upon the stage itself. To quote Mackenzie, they would be painted on the front with opaque scene paint and on the rear with translucent dyes. Lighted from the front, they appeared like other scenery, but when lights were brought up in the rear, the opaque portions were silhouetted, and the light shining through portions painted with the dyes produced an entirely new scenic effect. I think it's quite likely that Holland's display of scenery involved the use of such drop cloths, painted to allow for such vivid effects. I realize this is a little bit hard to read, so let me just tell you what it says. The first of the scenes opened with a depiction of arguably the most historic location in Philadelphia, a view of the city, quote, taken from the large tree at Kensington, under which the treaty with the Indians was made by the celebrated William Penn for the state of Pennsylvania. The second scene pictured the waterworks, then on Center Square. This was another Philadelphia landmark, an imposing marbled pump house, and an engineering marvel designed by Benjamin Latrobe. Scene 3 was different. It moved south, away from Philadelphia, to offer a view of Baltimore, and to offer that view in a format that was called an idophusicon. This term explicitly referenced a technology of theatrical illusion that had been popularized by Philippe de Lautherberg in London during the 1780s. It was a technology that used special lighting, and sometimes sound, to create sensations of motion or the passage of time from dawn to dusk. Charles Willson Peale attempted something similar at his museum in the 1780s as well. Finally, scenes 4 and 5 shifted from the urban to the rural, representing sites that were famous for their natural beauty and wonder. namely the Great Falls of the Potomac, north of Washington, D.C., and the Natural Bridge in Virginia, a towering stone formation admired by Jefferson, among others. Now, to call this production a display of scenery was both modest, given the scale and ambition of the images, and a little misleading, because the production not only featured the lighting technologies of the Ido Fusicon, it also included songs and dance. I'm not sure if you can read this, I realize it's very small, but a comic dance and song called Sailors on Shore came between the first and the second scenes, and between the fourth and the fifth, just to give one more example, came the performance of what was called a national overture, composed by Mr. Reinagle. It's important to emphasize that this mixture of pictorial scenes with lighting, music, and dance was the first of its kind for the Chestnut Street Theater. To the best of my knowledge, it was the first for any kind of theater in the U.S., and for those of you who know anything about the theater history of the U.S., that was pretty short history in 1805. While we might call this a mixture of media, or simply mixed media, as a whole, this production also fits Dick Higgins' understanding of the intermedium as a hybrid, as a novel form born of the combination of formerly discrete media. Or better yet, it fits Coleridge's description of, and I quote again here, works which fall conceptually between media that are already known. There's much to say about this program in each of these views, but let me zero in on the two scenes noted here, the views of the Treaty Elm and the waterworks. I think it's very likely that Holland drew upon Birch's views for these displays, and if he did, then we might add yet another layer to this consideration of intermediality. For this would involve the migration of one pictorial medium, the printed engraving, into or onto another, that is, the painted drop cloths of Holland's scenic displays. So why do I think this? Well, it has to do in part with sources. Holland had a ready source for the waterworks scene in Birch's views, which featured in both the first and second editions. More importantly, in 1805, no other artist, again, to the best of my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, had yet published a picture of this impressive building. For the opening scene of the large tree at Kensington, on the other hand, or the so-called Treaty Elm, Holland again could have looked to Birch. As you all surely know, this site was deeply significant in the local imagination, marking the origins of the city and the colony itself. As an illustration of beginnings, it was therefore a fitting commencement for Holland's display as well as Birch's views. His publication opened with this view of the Treaty Elm. Birch, of course, wasn't the only one to picture this historic place. His son Thomas reproduced the Kensington view as a large painting, and in 1801, George Beck and Thomas Cartwright included a scene very similar to Birch's in a series of published aquatints. That same year, in 1801, William Birch authorized a revised and enlarged version of his frontispiece as a single engraving. And again, see this on the wall of the exhibition. Credited to Thomas Birch and Samuel Seymour, this so-called large plate measured over 18 inches high by nearly 24 inches wide. This was a sizable print by any measure, and considerably bigger than those in the first edition views. More so than the smaller engravings in Birch's views, this large plate would have offered Holland a helpful model for his first scene. Simply put, this version made the view more visible, presenting a larger visual field on which to model an expansive theatrical depiction. The large plate increased the visual interest of the foreground by populating the riverbank with more stoppage figures, and it exaggerated the contrast of light and shadow between the foreground and the background, rendering the Treaty Elm as a silhouette and thereby enhancing the visual drama. Now imagine how this picture would appear if it was swelled to fit the width of the stage at the Chestnut Street Theater. As I've noted, Holland's scenes would have been executed on drops, fabric specially painted on both the front and the back to enable changing light effects. Illuminated from the front of the stage, the image might have looked like an ordinary painting, impressive in itself as a huge landscape. But illuminated from behind, it would have altered dramatically. The shadowy foreground would appear to cast a frame around the scene, and the eye would skip through the highlighted areas in the middle ground, from the tar pot issuing white plumes in the center, to the trio of ladies at the right, to the billowing sails at the left. The southern sky would glow with the effervescence of a late afternoon sun, drawing one's vision deep into the distance and generating the illusion of three-dimensional space. Together, Holland's first and second scenes of the Treaty Elm and the Waterworks would have functioned like geographical and cultural bookends for Philadelphia. Kensington marked the eastern edge of the city, as well as its historical points of origin. The Waterworks, on the other hand, brought spectators to the westernmost point of urban development around 1805, and it symbolized Philadelphia's industry and its modernity. We don't know exactly how the Chestnut Street audiences responded to the experience of seeing their city represented back to them in this manner. And I should mention that this program was only meant to run for one night. According to contemporary newspapers, it appears to have run for at least a half dozen times. And if we think about the fact that about 200 people could squeeze into the theater, at any given time, we're talking about 10 to 12,000 people in Philadelphia possibly seeing these views over the course of a week. It's a huge audience for this time. The effect on them, or the effect on spectators already familiar with Birch's views, must have been impressive. Instead of holding a folio or a flat print in their hands, instead of looking downward, or instead of peering at a framed picture on the wall, now they could project themselves into a scene wherein the painted figures seemed as large as the people seated in the theater. In a way that Birch's engravings could never quite realize then, the naturalism of Holland's scenic display transported them to the banks of the Delaware, depositing them at a legendary site for Philadelphia. Like the genteel spectators in the foreground, the illusion allowed them to dally under the branches of the treaty elm. I'd be happy to say more about Holland's scenes later on, but for now, let me return to their significance with regard to that question of intermediality. First, Holland's production allows us to recognize the space of the theater as a place of visual education and entertainment. And that in itself is a bigger claim than it might seem. In 1805, Philadelphians were hard-pressed to find public exhibitions of art in the city. Between the Columbianum exhibition of 1795 and the Pennsylvania Academy exhibitions, the annual exhibitions beginning in 1811, fine art was largely visible at just a handful of public sites, ones that tended to mix pictures with objects of natural science, mechanical devices, and curiosities, like Charles Willson Peale's museum. Despite this chronological gap of some 15 years in regular exhibitions of art, however, scholars have tended to overlook the theater as a place of visual display. Holland, together with related evidence of theatrical pantomimes and even panoramas, demonstrates that the playhouse was actively doubling as a site for the projection and consumption of imagery, often highly illusionistic imagery, some of it animated with lighting and sound, and some of it derived from an existing sphere of paintings and prints. I suspect that there's probably many more instances of intermediality to be identified in the visual culture of the early Republic if we're willing to peer beyond familiar canons and familiar spaces. Finally, Holland's spectacle compels us to probe the in-betweenness of cross-medial exchanges, the circulation of images within a visual culture, and their transmission from one form, like a small print, into another, like a huge painting. In appropriating, magnifying, and illuminating Birch's views through an immersive technology of theatrical illusion, the Chestnut Street Theater not only expanded the audience for Birch's art, it also amplified its visual and ideological potential. So to return to that question I posed at the outset, how does Birch matter in 2018? We can thus see how he challenges us to reconsider evidence of intermediality within the rather tidy and arguably too limited category that we call American art. The art of the early United States was not just a world of paintings, prints, sculpture, architecture, and the decorative arts. It was everything that fell in between those media and mutated through them. By way of conclusion, let me suggest that this effort to see intermediality is not exclusive, not mutually exclusive with that other possibility that I've explored, that of an art history of immigration. Far from it, because the theater, like the Columbianum, was also a space of immigrant creativity. I've noted that Thomas Wignall was an English emigre, but so was his co-director, Alexander Reinagel, and many of the other names that I've mentioned: Gilbert Fox, George Beck, Thomas Cartwright, John Joseph Holland, not to mention all of Holland's assistants in the scene painting room. Perhaps it's only fitting that we can best discern qualities of the intermedial in the labor of these recent immigrants, artists who themselves were navigating movements between England and North America. Thank you.